If you're a maintenance supervisor for a commercial property, you've had to deal with everything from leaky faucets to flickering light bulbs. But nothing's worse than that ancient boiler that's lived in the building since the day it was built, 50 years ago. It's enough to make anyone lose their cool. That's where Grainger comes in. With industrial-grade products and dependable fast delivery, Grainger can help with any challenge, from worn-out components to everyday necessities. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can reach me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting if you would just email me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. I have a returning guest today. Steve Kopesky is back along with Ted Rubinstein. We did an hour about Jimmy Hoffa. And we didn't even get into the midsection of Jimmy Hoffa's life or his assassination or his legacy or anything like that. So we're going to have two more parts. There's going to be part 2. There's going to be a part 3 as well. And then there's going to be a series, a 9-part series on Jimmy Hoffa. So firstly, Ted Rubinstein, are you there?
Yes, I am. You were kidding about the 9 parts, I hope.
I don't know, man. With a half-hour break in between each one, Ted, so don't worry. Okay. But Ted, why don't you remind the audience? You've been here 1,000 times, okay? But remind the audience, who is Ted Rubinstein?
I'm an old parapolitical researcher who's been studying the Kennedy assassination for 50 years this year, believe it or not. I've been following it closely since 1974. And as some of the audience knows, I knew Mae Brussel. I worked with Dave Emery. And, well, I go way back. What can I say?
Studying for 50 years, and he's almost ready for that test. Go ahead. Continue, Ted. Ted, you want to plug your friend there, too, right, Doug Campbell?
Oh, I was going to plug him at the end, but I'll plug him now if you want. I was just going to recommend to your audience the 3 podcasts that my buddy Doug Campbell contributes to concerning the JFK assassination. You can find them on your favorite podcast carrier. One's called The Dallas Action. One is called the one that Rob Clark does, and sometimes Doug Campbell is a guest of his, the Lone Gunman podcast. That's really Rob's show, not Doug's. Lone Gunman podcast. And then the show they do together monthly is called Quick Hits. Notes and news and notes about the JFK assassination for the previous month, basically what that show is.
And that one's starring Luigi Mangione for Quick Hits. Mr. Steve Kopesky, can you remind the audience who is Steve Kopesky?
I guess you could say I'm kind of a protege of Ted Rubinstein. I've been a parapolitical researcher for, honestly, since I was 13 or 14. I'm almost 35 now, so not quite as long as Ted, but I try to follow in the footsteps of Mae Brussel and Dave Emery. And for the last 5 years, I've been putting together all this research and documentation about our topic today, Jimmy Hoffa, which toying with the idea of either turning it into a book or a documentary, one of the two, if I can get my act together enough. Like I said, I don't have a publisher or anything, so that kind of takes away, deadlines and money and stuff. Otherwise, I might have had a finished product by now.
Yeah, unfortunately, publishing these days, too, there's not a lot of money up front. Not like the old days, man, that's for sure. So how do we
want... acknowledged author, you can get money up front, but otherwise, no, go begging.
Oh, no, it's a tough game these days, for sure. So who wants to start us off on this next phase of James Hoffa?
Well, I thought I would start, if you guys don't mind. Kind of just as an overview of kind of the milieu that was kind of starting to form. Basically, here, I'll say it this. So kind of coming to the end of the New Deal era, which starts in the 1930s, and by the mid-'70s, in America's switching over to the neoliberal reforms, which we still live in. I don't know why people act like we don't live in that. The Kemp-Roth bill that was passed in 81 has not gone away. Anyway, Reagan gets a lot of credit for that. Reagan, I mention him because him and Jimmy would weirdly kind of have similar trajectories, but by the time they meet, they kind of go off into different directions. But those neoliberal reforms, Reagan gets a lot of the credit for, although a lot of them started to get rolled out under Jimmy Carter. I guess Reagan was the better pitch man. I would draw people's attention back to Jimmy Carter's famous Malaise speech where he said, "All right, guys, we have to tighten our belt because it's about to get rough." Reagan was a little more optimistic about it. But I mention that because some of the regulations...
That was a great speech. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that was a great speech that Carter made, and he got totally lambasted for it.
He absolutely did, because those types of things aren't supposed to happen in America. I think that was the undertone of that is we're not supposed to tighten our belts because we were the anointed, mansion on the hill. What is that phrase? Anyway, I mentioned this because Reagan almost could be called the great deregulator because he started this wave of deregulation. And actually one big piece of deregulation he introduced was involved the trucking industry, which interestingly enough, a lot of the organized crime elements in the Teamsters had actually outright opposed, so much to the point that by, shenanigans involved with that would put at that time, Teamsters President Roy Lee Williams in prison for trying to bribe Nevada Senator Howard Cannon. Reagan, in contrast, only deregulated a few industries, one being the savings and loans industry, which that's a big whoops, because that ends up just being a boon for organized crime and possibly the CIA, depending on who you ask. Anyway, so cut me off if I go too long, but I'd like to point out as quickly as I can.
I just want an interruption.
Yes, sir.
For the great source on the savings and loan scandals and the involvement of both the CIA and the mafia, especially the latter, I recommend Inside Job.
Yes, I agree.
Stephen Pizzo. Excellent book. And it's available. It's an inexpensive book, and you'll get a lot out of it.
Yeah, I second that. That's an excellent reference. So I'd like to start out from my perspective on some of the things that I think get lost in the shuffle when people talk about Jimmy Hoffa. I've been calling this in my head Deep Politics and the Death of Jimmy Hoffa. That's a nod to Professor Peter Dale Scott. So stuff like the gangsters and the corruption and the possible involvement in the Kennedy assassination and Marilyn Monroe and all that. I think that kind of distracts away from some of the things that are really important, and which is why I've begun to consider that Hoffa basically had the potential to be to start a really genuine grassroots, progressive, multicultural workers movement. Now that might sound insane, given the legacy that most people remember and that gets carried on, but I think it also plays into, at the core of it, why his assassination, and I do say assassination, the FBI and the DOJ weren't really all that excited or that interested in officially solving the case. That's why we have, every couple of years a new dig going on. And I say assassination, I'll quote Daniel Hopsicker, which Opperman Report listeners should be very well versed in, when he spoke on the death of Barry Seal. He said it was an assassination because an assassination means it changes the course of history as opposed to, just a standard, criminal, murder. The things that I wonder if people really remember about Hoffa was with the civil rights movement. Do any of you guys have any idea of his involvement with the civil rights movement, perhaps?
Yeah, I was totally unaware.
Well, so the Teamsters...
I'm largely unaware, I would say.
I'm not surprised. Within the Teamsters as an organization, Hoffa openly supported a non-discrimination policy as the general president. And there's a 1958 open letter to the union from the International where he says, as Americans, we should be opposed to bigotry and racial discrimination at every turn and do everything possible to make the Bill of Rights a reality for every citizen. And he had a strict non-discriminatory hiring policy at every local, pretty much in the country. He goes on, he says, if they want segregation, we don't want them. We pride ourselves on the fact that there are no Jim Crow locals in our union. As a matter of fact, the National Bar Association praised the Teamsters for its non-discriminatory activities. Now, just to be completely intellectually honest, people point to, instances that Hoffa, maybe he wasn't the most, progressively enlightened guy, perhaps in his personal life. I hate to be so crass to just say, well, he was a man of his era. He's a street guy.
Are you
coming up at his...
saying he had mistresses when he was married?
No. Hoffa? No. No. We can get into that later. As a matter of fact, the Teamsters were really the only union in America to successfully organize in the Jim Crow South. Now, yes, technically, Hoffa did not support the 1963 March on Washington, but, and this is a very big but, he said only a strong, solid, large union could end racial divide. He said he was arguing against racism long before a lot of people were, as a matter of fact. He did, like we said in the other one, he did kind of consider a lot of the more liberal and progressive reforms kind of just a Band-Aid for the failures of capitalism. He was very aware of that. He said, I don't believe picketing is going to solve the problem. Now, actually, even more explicitly, if people remember the murder of the civil rights worker Viola Liuzzo, do you guys remember this case?
I'm familiar with that, yes, very much.
Yeah, she was a civil rights worker who was murdered. She was shot to death by the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama.
With an FBI informant in tow.
Yes, correct. Thank you for bringing that up. So Jimmy, he didn't only just show sympathy in the press, but he publicly dedicated himself to her cause after that. He after the funeral for Liuzzo, who was actually a Detroit native, which is where Hoffa's from, he attends the funeral, and afterwards he publicly, pictures, you can find them, meets with Dr. Martin Luther King in person, and he gives a $25,000 donation to King in the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And he says publicly, the Teamsters will give whatever help we can give you. And he received a lot of backlash for this, particularly among some pockets of the rank and file in his union. Again, this is, late 50s, early 60s. People were really, some people weren't totally enlightened on this issue. But he didn't denounce the move when he was receiving backlash. And as a matter of fact, him and Dr. King had actually met up. And Hoffa was offering him strategic advice on perhaps getting railroad workers and other truckers, non-union truckers involved in doing a transportation strike and a boycott.
A boycott of whom?
To shut down and protest. Sorry, were you going to say something, Ed?
No, but just imagine what a force that would have been, Well,
we'll get to that one. Basically, Hoffa had counseled King on, the logistics on doing a massive transportation strike. And let's not forget that King, when he was assassinated himself in Memphis, he was there to help aid striking sanitation workers. Now, prison reform. A lot of people have, some people who know about this with Hoffa, after he went to prison, and although he says publicly that he had celebrity treatment, which he did, I don't think, right off the bat, when he's in prison, they confiscate his diabetes medicine and they laugh at him and they flush it down the toilet. And he talks very, very publicly about how awful the prison system is, and he goes on and he starts an organization called the National Association for Justice, and along with that, he even starts a crisis hotline, a crisis control center where inmates can call up and give their grievances. People have said that this was just a crass way for him to stay in the media while he was fighting something in his pardon from Nixon. We'll get into that a little later, but if you look at everything he says publicly, he was genuinely interested in true prison reform. And the thing that I like... Go ahead, Ted.
Go ahead. Finish your thought, and then I have something to add if you're not making the same point I am.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I hate to put this super crass, but, at the time, a big leading advocate of prison reform was somebody like Angela Davis, a very famous feminist, black, openly communist. I'm an admirer of Davis, so I really hate to put it in these terms, but you put it in that time frame in the mid 70s, who's going to absorb that message? If you need to get, blue collar, working class white guys on board with prison reform, who are they going to listen to? A guy like Jimmy Hoffa or, a Berkeley radical type who they're all being brainwashed in the media to hate, if that makes sense.
So are you saying that he had some sort of relationship politically with Angela Davis?
No, but I just know that, in the context, who is a bunch of guys working on a loading dock going to listen to about prison reform? Someone like Angela Davis or Jimmy Hoffa?
Yeah, I see.
I hate to put it so crass.
No, especially in those times, of course. I mean,
Exactly.
Racism was accepted. It was expected,
Exactly,
Okay,
and I think that's... Sorry, Ted, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Well, and another thing that doesn't get nearly enough attention is Hoffa had been planning to establish a conference on transportation unity, and that was basically going to bring together the Teamsters Union, the Longshoremen's Union, the Maritime Union, the Railroad Unions, the Airline Unions, pretty much all the transportation unions. So what does this
Can I go back
sound?
to the prison reform thing? Just one more point to make about that.
Yes.
When he got out of prison, he was really concerned about the homosexuality and people being having assaults committed on them while they were in prison. And he was an advocate of keeping the homosexuals separate from the rest of the prison population.
Yeah,
That was a big thing with him.
By today's standards, his language is a little rough in regards to that, but I rewatched that interview. I rewatched that interview recently. It was on the Dick Cavett show.
It was excellent. You can find it on YouTube.
Yeah, I recommend people checking that out. He appears with Melvin Belli. Anyway, like I was saying,
1971, I believe, or 1973, in there.
About that,
Television show it's from.
But no, I interpreted that. No, Hoffa said that homosexuals were big targets in prison and to keep them safer. Anyway, so like I said, he was planning on establishing this conference of transportation unity, and like I listed off, he basically was planning on incorporating every form of transportation worker in America. What does that say to you, Ed?
A general strike.
Yeah.
Which I've always advocated for because it works. Look at the French.
Especially if you look at that. So he's got guys that bring the cargo onto ships, guys that unload the cargo from the ships, guys that put the cargo onto the trucks, and that deliver it to everywhere they go. That's pretty much the atomic bomb, which I believe they pretty much described it to being heightened period of the Cold War. But like the atomic bomb, Hoffa did say that I don't want to use it though, but I want to have that power. Now, basically, you could see a lot of that stuff of him, prison reform, civil rights, all of that. Now, some people have pointed that this is just him crying a victim. They see him as a crook who's diverting attention away from all his crimes. And I'll admit for several of the past years, I saw him as kind of a Donald Trump type figure, especially the first time I read his autobiography, as in, sure, he had some good points that I like, but at the end, he's not going to deliver them because he's not genuine, if that makes sense. I kind of had that feeling. But like I said in the beginning, in the last episode, Jimmy didn't have billionaires backing him, As a matter of fact, it was kind of the opposite towards the end. Unfortunately, the infrastructure with all that corruption that he had kind of maintained and participated in, it did kind of end up being a form of blowback to him. And as a matter of fact, the guy who basically had stolen the union out from under Hoffa, Frank Fitzsimmons, as a matter of fact, he did have the backing of the establishment. He had the protection of the Nixon administration. The Nixon administration was protecting him. The Nixon DOJ was halting all kinds of investigations and wiretapping on Fitzsimmons. And who else was on Fitzsimmons' sides but the business class, the employers' class, because he was giving them way more what they wanted, way more than the rank and file. As a matter of fact, at that time, during the stagflation period, Fitz completely sold the membership of the Teamsters out. They were guaranteed a $3 raise, and Fitzsimmons basically settled on half of that, like $1.50 raise. So, yeah, Jimmy was a blue-collar guy through and through. And when he went to prison, he saw the awful conditions. He knew that civil rights were basically everybody's rights. He knew that. And at the end of his life, he actually had the support of the more radical elements within the Teamsters Union. Teamsters for a Democratic Union, that's a reform group within the Teamsters, had backings from guys like Ralph Nader back in the day. And this is what made him very dangerous to me. And this is why I think I would consider his death an assassination. I mean, how many people know a lot of that stuff that I just laid out? And that's barely, the half of it.
Yeah, absolutely. This is all news to me.
So as far as Bobby Kennedy goes, part of me does see this as kind of a misplacement of energies, perhaps. I'll give him big credit to the fact that as Attorney General, he began probably the most exhaustive investigation that's ever been done against organized crime ever, and even to this day, I believe, though I think it's kind of a flawed one. He described organized crime as the enemy within. That's his book. I do recommend checking it out.
Yeah, I love that. He wrote a book called The Enemy Within.
Yes.
When there was all this hubbub about Trump and the FBI, you heard so much outrage about that. They would talk about an enemy within the United States, and they were referencing the leftist element.
Yeah,
But,
if you Google The Enemy Within, if you want to buy a copy of it, the first one that's probably going to pop up is a book by a deranged person named David Horowitz that's also called The Enemy Within. Skip that one and look for the one by Bobby Kennedy. It is a useful tool if you're interested in this terrain.
Absolutely.
But I'll say that his pursuit of organized crime, starting with the McClellan Committee, was good, although, like I said, I think it was kind of a misplaced energy. If you want to think about it like in terms of the war on drugs, I think the efforts and energy should have gone after the root problem and not the addicts. I think that's kind of the way I tend to view the McClellan Committee. You want to, fix the system that breeds addiction. So in a speech in 1964, the Teamsters were the only, like I said, the Teamsters were really the only union to actually have success in the Jim Crow South. And he says it explicitly in the speech. He says the communities that were organized by the Teamsters, where people actually earned good wages and had good benefits, were starting to experience less violence and less racial animosity. Can you believe that? When people are secure and happy and taken care of, prejudices seem to go away. Now, Sorry, I lost my place in my notes here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's very interesting about the Hoffa's political leanings and the alliances he made, and the meeting with Dr. King. Mm-hmm. I certainly hadn't heard about that.
Well, that's all out there. That's all out there. It's not even hard to find. All right, so I'm going to pick up kind of what we kind of started getting into last week real quick. So, like we said, in the 1930s, Hoffa had met a woman named Sylvia Pagano, who had a clerical job in one of the unions. People have said that they had a love affair. That's actually up for debate. Hoffa, not great with women. I think he's been described pretty universally as being kind of shy around women. But anyway, Hoffa had married his wife in 1936, and as far as I know, she was just his universe. But Sylvia Pagano, she had moved from Detroit she had moved to Detroit from Kansas City, and through her family, she had relationships to a lot of organized crime figures. And that's where this character, Frankie Coppola, comes in. We were talking about him last week, and he's probably one of the scariest gangsters I've personally read about. So keep that in mind. One of Jimmy's biggest accomplishments was, and part of one of his ascendance in the International Brotherhood of Teamsters was in 1937, when kind of in the aftermath of his organization efforts at Kroger's. If you remember, they were calling themselves the Strawberry Boys because they used a big batch of strawberries as leverage. he was brought in to work for Local 299 in Detroit of the Teamsters Union, and they had successfully pulled off a citywide strike, which lasted 3 days, and overall was completely successful. And they were able to get the Teamster drivers up to 60 cents an hour, which is frightening how little that is by today's standards. But at that time, yeah. So, like I just mentioned, through that woman Sylvia Pagano and Frank Coppola, that's pretty much one of the, I'd probably say the first introduction that Jimmy has to proper organized crime, particularly two guys, Angelo Mele and Santo Perrone, are these two guys who actually, at the time, and this is important to put into context, Santo Perrone, he was actually considered Detroit's top union buster. And as a matter of fact, he had been implicated in an assassination attempt on the United Auto Workers president, Walter Reuther. Now, this info that I'm about to bring up comes from a guy called Vincent Persante, who was head of the Organized Crime Task Force for the Michigan State's Attorney's Office up until the 80s. And Hoffa basically had used his relationship with Perrone and Angelo Mele in that citywide strike that we just talked about that earned the drivers about up to 60 cents an hour. But he didn't use them for muscle or intimidation or anything like that, actually, interestingly enough. What he seemed to do was he persuaded the gangsters to be neutral, so to not be on the side of the union or the employers, which they typically picked the employer side up to that point. They stayed out of it. So as a result, Hoffa gets a lot of praise for this, for his work in this citywide strike in 1937, and it gets him attention from the International, especially from the International then president, a guy named Dan Tobin. Now, the benefit for this, for the mob, for staying out of the strike, was, it seems to be, and this is hard to confirm because pretty much all the union's records from this time period have been destroyed, interestingly, was we assume that this is probably...
By who?
Good question.
Yeah, okay.
This is from the 1930s. Yeah, who knows? The benefit that the mob got out of this staying neutral in that strike was that they were probably allowed entry into Detroit's trucking industry, which they hadn't had yet, because guys like Santo Perrone had, interest in, construction and steel hauling and, stuff like that. So I guess their reward for staying out of the strike was entry into the trucking business proper. Any questions up to this point?
Where did you get the information from Pierre Sante?
Pierre Sante? You just look it up.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, ask me later.
Google it. Yeah.
So, like we said last week, Jimmy, early on when he was properly in the Teamsters Union, he was kind of like a protege of that guy, Farrell Dobbs. And after Jimmy, finished up that, I guess we call it apprenticeship, problems start to happen in Minnesota where Dobbs was. And after the passage of the Smith Act, which if you're familiar with that, it's basically an anti-communist act. It's illegal to be a communist, basically. And Dobbs was an open communist, so he decided that he just had to leave the Teamsters. And he had gotten into even more fragile territory on top of that, because after he left the Teamsters, he joined up with Denny Lewis, who was affiliated with the CIO Congress. It's considered was a more progressive labor coalition, basically. And Denny Lewis was head of what was called the United Construction Workers Organizing Committee. So he leaves the Teamsters. He joins up with this guy, Denny Lewis, with the CIO. And on top of that, he's trying to help the CIO organize owner-operator drivers. Now, this would be a thorn in the Teamsters side for a long time. It's
what time period are we talking about here?
Late 1930s.
Oh, that early.
So Dan Tobin, who I mentioned earlier, he's the international president. He's like the Jimmy Hoffa of the Teamsters at this point. He knows about this, newcomer, this new tough guy newcomer in Detroit, and he thinks he might be a good guy to go back to Minnesota and get this all in line. And this I consider very important. This is what I think is the real crossroads for Jimmy Hoffa. So according to Hoffa, he says, "We went with our crack guys, had the war, and won every battle, took over their office, and Dobbs left and joined the Socialist Workers' Party." So that's pretty vague. Now, Farrell Dobbs would later say publicly, kind of as a rebuttal to this, he said, yes, that's all true. But Hoffa was, and this is very important, aided by the Minneapolis Police Department, the courts, the county, the state, the mayor, the governor, an anti-labor law that had been rigged by the Republican governor, the FBI, the DOJ, and the President of the United States, FDR, who was getting hostile to the concept of striking leading up to World War II. Now, I mentioned this whole thing because this, when he goes back to Minnesota, I think this is where Jimmy sells out for the first time. Not when he asked the mob to be neutral, but I think it's here. I can't officially prove it yet. I'm working on the documentation, but I think it's when he cooperates with the police and the courts in Minnesota is when he gets brought into this parapolitical milieu, which we'll get into shortly, Ted. So, as a result of all that, Farrell Dobbs goes to jail. He's actually indicted for sedition under the Smith Act. But the guy that he had teamed up with, Denny Lewis, who was affiliated with the CIO, he says, all right, I'm going to get revenge on Hoffa. I'm coming to Detroit to try to take over Local 299 and absorb up all the Teamsters in Detroit into his union. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
I'm just curious. Did he commit some act that made the charge of sedition stick? Or,
It was his organizing activities, yeah.
wow, that's really repressive.
Well, are you surprised? So the CIO.
Well,
like
I thought under Wilson that stuff was going on, and then you had a period in the between the McCarthy period and going back to the what I said with the Wilson did a lot of rounding up.
there's various
radical.
Red Scares. Yeah.
Yeah. So this one I didn't know about, the Smith Act. I mean, I've heard of it vaguely, but I didn't know it entailed sedition and that this Farrell Dobbs went to jail behind it. That's interesting.
I'll bring up actually another past Opperman Report guest, Jeffrey Caulfield, in his book General Walker and the Murder of President Kennedy.
I love that book.
Well, he does reference a memo that was at Fort Benning or Fort Jack that basically said America's religion is anti-communism and America's religion is going to be anti-communism. I can't remember where it said in that book. That book is like 1,000 pages, but
yeah, I could have him back 20 times. He wouldn't run out of stuff. That guy's got a ton of material.
On all those podcasts that I mentioned, that we would love to have him back.
No, I know a lot of people take have criticisms of that book, but I think it's very valuable. Anyway, yeah. So the CIO and Denny Lewis are coming to Detroit. They want to take over Local 299. Now, this time, Hoffa does ask the mob to actually do something, and he does explicitly ask Santo Perone, Angelo Melli, and Frankie Coppola to help get Denny Lewis and the CIO out of Detroit. And they do step in, and it works big time. I don't know if I need to be more explicit about that. Any questions so far?
Yeah, I missed a part. Explicit about what?
That this time the Mafia did step in.
Okay.
They didn't just remain neutral like they did in the strike in 37.
So there was a lot of violence, leg breaking, stuff like that.
Yes, very much so. So at this time, and this is according to Charles Saragusa, who is a very important figure in parapolitical research. Everybody should know him. He was a Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent. Now, according to him, at this time, Detroit was becoming the primary point of drug imports, and the Detroit Mafia was actually feeding everywhere, even New York. And in Detroit, the top
It was
hoods...
coming through the Windsor Tunnel in Canada, I presume. That was the route.
So the top narcotic hoodlums... Yeah. I mean, this will feed into the French Connection and all that. Yeah. So the two top guys in Detroit, the key receivers are John Prizziola and Rafael K. Serrano. Remember K. Serrano's name. Now, we had mentioned Frankie Coppola earlier. Coppola was actually technically a member of the Luciano family, or what was called the Luciano family at that time. And like we said, he had been in Detroit for some time, where he was enjoying what would be some political protection, and Hoffa, I don't know if Hoffa directly sanctioned this, but he, I guess as a reward for helping them kick the CIO and Denny Lewis out of Detroit, was that a Teamsters local is set up on paper. It's actually a fake local, 985, and it basically acts as a front for Prizziola and Caserano to import Coppola's drugs. I know this sounds like I'm going back on all the things I said in the beginning about how truly progressive Hoffa was, but like I said, I think he was sucked into that parapolitical, what we're about to break down more, when he went back to Minnesota to help put down Farrell Dobbs. Now, everybody knows about Charlie Luciano's alliance with the military and the ONI and stuff during World War II. I don't think we need much of a rehash on that. But a lot of people might forget that when Luciano got deported back to Italy after he was let out of prison, he starts a pretty key drug trafficking network, along with a former Nazi collaborator, a Corsican named Antoine D'Agostino. Now, in 1948, two gangsters are deported from Detroit. One of them is Frankie Coppola, another was a guy named Sal Vitale. So when Coppola is deported in 48, he goes to Sicily, and he becomes what Professor Peter Dale Scott calls the post-war intelligence mafia collaboration. He calls it Operation X in his book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. But really what all it does is it helps massacre Sicilian left-wingers, so socialists, communists, and simultaneously lays the foundations for the post-war transatlantic drug trafficking networks. I would say that this part of Scott's theory is elaborated further by Douglas Valentine, another Opperman Report guest, in his book, The Strength of the Wolf. The intelligence.
Did you say that Vitale was partnering, or he was in the company of? You said Sal Vitale was with Three Fingers Coppola. Is that the other guy you mentioned in that context? You mentioned the Sal Vitale. Hello?
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 Yeah, I'm here. What happened here?
Yeah, Steve, did you hear the question?
No, sorry, you broke it up.
Yes,
sorry.
I was asking Steve what you just said about Sal Vitale, because I was going to mention that name in a different context.
Okay, what?
Well, he went on to become a rat in the Bonanno family, and he ratted out Joe Messina, or Messino, and then Messino was arrested, then he turned state's witness. But this is the same guy this is, I guess, what you mentioned was Sal Vitale when he was just a young man. Is that correct?
I don't know for sure, but everything you just said tracks with the trajectory that I know of this entire network, I would say. I've consulted privately with Doug Valentine about this. I was kind of wondering if this importing the gangsters to help put down left-wing and socialist movements in Italy maybe had like a Phoenix program model to it. And I was feeling pretty impressed with myself that I thought I came up with a really smart analogy. But Doug told me something much more interesting, which he said, well, no, as a matter of fact, labor busters who worked for the robber barons is where the CIA learned everything they know about this type of operations. So that would be, things like the Pinkerton Private Detective Agency. It was all of their tactics that was where the CIA learned a lot of this stuff. So I guess crushing labor really is like just one of the
as American as apple pie.
Yeah, it comes to second nature.
Yeah. Yes. Any questions so far?
No.
Yeah, okay. So this infrastructure that we've been breaking down with the importation of thugs like Coppola and all that, it was started by the OSS with elements of kind of what was remaining of Mussolini's secret police, the OVRA. We didn't even get into Vito Genovese's whole role in Italy when he fled America in the 30s, and he befriended Mussolini's brother-in-law, and he gave money to the fascist party. We probably don't have time to go into a lot of that, but he also got...
Well, not only that, but it seems to be roving sort of far afield.
It's just interesting, this mafia-fascist connection.
That is interesting.
Yeah, but anyway, this whole network is being found, these drug trafficking mobsters that are putting down, socialist movements in Europe. I mean, it's being, propped up by what this new thing called the CIA, Bill Donovan's World Commerce Corporation, the P2 Lodge. So this is basically Operation.
Well, the P2 Lodge didn't come along until considerably later.
Well, I mean, the early versions of it.
Yeah, you're right. And actually, I should say when I'm just talking about when it unraveled, which was 1981, but presumably, yeah, it has a history, considerably going back before that. So you're inaccurate in bringing it up.
Exactly.
So because you talk about the antecedents.
Yeah, this is the antecedents to Gladio. Now, I mentioned this because I have to assume that Hoffa probably knew that in the back of his head that, these are the types of things that he helped to enable. Now, so anyway, back in America, like we said, he's introduced to, the gangsters in Detroit through Sylvia Pagano, also through Angelo Mele, one of the Detroit gangsters that Jimmy became, affiliated with. His in-laws is the Dio Guardi family, Johnny Dio being the standout in that. And it's through her that he meets Mo Dalitz, who starts out in the Purple Gang. Also in Ohio, where Hoffa begins a line of communication with a guy named William Presser, and he's kind of like what Jimmy Hoffa is in Michigan, William Presser is in Ohio. His son, Jackie Presser, he would go on to be the Teamsters general president in the 80s. He's a big, fat, dumb, fail son who's handed the leadership of the union from his father, and he spends his entire Teamsters presidency as an FBI informant and starts being friends with Lyndon LaRouche and starts incorporating LaRouche silliness into all his speeches for the Teamsters and stuff. But back to Mo Dalitz. So Mo Dalitz had set up shop in Ohio, and he's head of the Mayfield Road gang. And Dalitz was sent to Vegas first by Meyer Lansky to keep tabs on Bugsy Siegel, and subsequently Bugsy Siegel was murdered. And the Desert Inn was built by Mo Dalitz with him and a gambler named Wilbur Clark. He got $90,000 from Dalitz, and Dalitz had 74% ownership of the Desert Inn. So this is a good place to actually describe the actual pension fund, which is a big part of the Hoffa story. Now, specifically the Central States Pension Fund. So in 1955, when Hoffa was not yet the president, but he was in charge. He was the leader of the Michigan Teamsters in the Central States Drivers Council, which was a pretty powerful position for what it was. And he began negotiating with the trucking companies to set aside $2 per member and put it into a pension each week. So within a few years, basically, there was already $10 million in this, and that's back then money. Imagine what that is today. So Hoffa started to get the idea that this pension fund, it wouldn't only be, insurance for the members and, contribute to their benefits and stuff, but it was also a way to build power for the union overall. The way Hoffa described it is the pension fund offered the union a way to reward friends and to make new ones. So to accomplish this, Hoffa took control of the pension through stacking the board with trustees, basically. There's a board of 16 guys, but they're all kind of loyalists to him. And another big move that he makes, which is pretty revolutionary, is he switches the money from government bonds to real estate loans. So basically the pension fund was like a bank, basically, that Jimmy was completely in charge of. You had asked last week if a lot of, if all the loans got paid back or if a lot of them got defaulted on. And I kind of stumbled over the answer because there really aren't that many examples of it getting defaulted on. It turns out Jimmy was actually pretty good at picking, which loans to give out because, I guess probably because he had so much, he had such a connection with the trucking and stuff. He kind of knew, what was good, what wasn't good, that type of thing, if it makes sense. Any questions so far?
Most of the loans did get paid back.
Pretty much. I mean, he had good.
Yeah, that's my understanding too.
Yeah. So so kind of the rise of the pension fund proper is it kind of coincides with the building of Las Vegas. One of the first ones that we did mention last week that the first thing they actually built in Vegas was a hospital with members of the Adelson family, which people know them, the famous ones. This guy was named Merv Adelson. They're big in Nevada, weren't they, Ed?
Oh, you kidding me? Yeah. Oh my God.
That's Lorimar Productions too in Hollywood.
Oh, okay.
Oh, really?
It was him and Erwin Molaski, who's another mobbed up businessman or producer. What was I going to say? With the guy you mentioned we're talking about is sorry, Edelman. Yeah, Edelman and Molaski, and they later sued Penthouse Magazine because they were all the owners of La Costa Country Club, which was built with Teamster pension money, and it features pretty prominently in this whole story. La Costa does. Oh
yeah. We'll touch on La Costa later, but okay. I guess so I would kind of think that the thing with the Teamsters pension fund in Las Vegas, it's not totally unwarranted because one of the things was it's kind of born out of necessity because casinos, people weren't really banks weren't really interested in loaning out money to build casinos. So really, and also the only people who were really qualified to run them were typically people who already had a history of like illegal gambling operations. So it was really difficult to get like a real strong economic base. Also, they really could only use criminals to really even run these places because they're the only guys that know how to do this stuff. So, the construction of Las Vegas and the rise of Vegas kind of coincides with as the pension fund is getting bigger and bigger and richer. Now, this is a good time to point out again through Santo Perone, Jimmy meets a guy named Paul Dorfman, who's a Chicago. He's like a holdover from the Capone era, and now Ted. So this is where we're going to get into some real deep politics here. So, Paul Dorfman, he's president at the time of the Chicago Waste Handlers Union, whose former president Leon Cook was murdered, which is how Dorfman became the president of this Waste Handlers Union. The local number is like 10246. Something like that. Now, the Central States Pension Fund, the big one that we keep referencing, because there's a few, but the Central States ones is the biggest one. He gives a no-bid contract to Paul Dorfman's family's insurance company, Union Casualty Insurance, to be in charge of the health insurance and stuff like that. Which to get a union, a contract with a major labor union like that, that's a pretty big get, even by today's standards. Ted, did you maybe want to speak on the significance?
On this significant event around the murder of Leon Cook with the Waste Handlers Union in 1939, brought in for questioning, and with a prominent headline in the Chicago papers, Jack Ruby was brought in for questioning about that murder.
Really?
And
way before anybody knew who Jack Ruby was.
Exactly. And subsequent to that, Ruby said that Leon Cook had been a pal of his, and he adopted his name as his middle name. He adopted Leon as his middle name from then on. So he was trying to, I guess, show that he was opposed to what Dorfman was going to bring to the union. But that's very curious that he would take that name, and yet he's really a suspect in the murder. So who knows what the truth is.
So I've always kind of interpreted that almost if this murder, if that never happened, because the Teamsters basically would come to Chicago and basically absorb the Waste Handlers Union into it. But in a way, you could say that that murder basically kind of almost instigates the rest of it. I guess without that murder, you could almost say that Las Vegas never gets built, if that makes sense.
But the Teamsters would have had prominence in Chicago regardless.
Not without
some
Dorfman.
other way.
I mean, Hoffa kind of saw his key to the Midwest mob because he knew the Detroit mob. He was getting to know the New York mob, but he had not really had a stronghold in the Midwest, and that would have been through the outfit, and that would have been through Paul Dorfman. That's how I've interpreted it.
Okay, I see your point. I was just thinking that they would find another avenue, but history shows, that it was Dorfman who played the prominent role there.
Yeah. Hey, Ed, you got any questions so far?
No, but I do want to point out we've only got about 9 minutes left, so and we are going to be doing a part 3 to this show, so people can look forward to a lot of stuff about anti-Castro and Chavez and a whole bunch of great stuff.
Well, here, let me finish off with this. So we could.
I think there's actually more than one Chavez, but I don't know if Cesar Chavez figures in this at all.
Tangentially,
but
actually.
Frank Chavez does. Anyway.
Well, if we could touch actually, because we can go forward a little bit to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. So, in regards to the CIA mafia plots against Castro, they really had no choice. The Warren Commission suppressed all the organized crime elements out of it, but by the time the House Select Committee on Assassinations had formed, we had already gone through the Church Committee and the Pike Committee and all that. So the plots had come out, so they basically were forced to look into them. And a lot of that comes from the Johnny Roselli's stories, and Johnny Roselli basically being the CIA's principal mafia contact in all this. And his story was that the CIA had dispatched a team to go into Cuba to kill Castro, but that apparently Castro flipped them and they sent them back, and they ended up murdering President Kennedy instead. Now, this is kind of the story that Roselli had floated to his attorneys, and it leaked all the way back up to Lyndon Johnson. So G. Robert Blakey, he was head of the HSCA. He points to Roselli and Sam Giancana of Chicago as the two central figures in the Castro assassinations plots between 60 and 63, which is backed up by the 1967 CIA Inspector General report. Roselli was killed after this. He was hacked up, put in an oil drum, floating around in Florida. Giancana's gunned down at his home right before he was said to go up to testify. Blakey's position was that the people who executed Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana were the same people who killed JFK. He points his finger at Roselli, Giancana, Santo Trafficante. He implicates Jimmy Hoffa.
You went a little fast there. Who makes this case?
Blakey.
He's saying that the same people who killed Kennedy killed Giancana and Roselli?
Yeah, he says that in the plot to kill the president.
Okay, yeah, I think I know what you're alluding to there. Yeah.
Yeah. He also implicates Jimmy Hoffa heavily as having the means and motive and opportunity. This is all in his book, The Plot to Kill the President. The second edition is called Fatal Hour.
Correct.
Do we want to get into the Charles Cromaldi angle, Ted?
No, I guess not.
Oh, no.
Well, it's just we should say that some people claim that there were earlier attempts to kill Castro involving CIA and the mob, and that involved Russell Buffalino and Jimmy Hoffa. But the evidence on that is somewhat murky.
So this comes from a guy called... Yeah, well, so he comes from Charles Cromaldi, who was a gangster and a longtime FBN informant, Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And I guess his handler was George Hunter White. Did you know that, Ted? George Hunter White is a very fascinating figure. He's a serious heavy. There's not a lot of info about him, unfortunately. According to Cromaldi, the mobsters who were involved with the CIA in these plots were responsible for...
Valentine's books are the best sources on George Hunter White, for sure.
Absolutely.
But he was plays the prominent role in the notorious Operation Midnight Climax.
A lot of the info that people find about George Hunter White, they really focus on the Operation Midnight Climax thing. I personally find that to be the least interesting thing about his career, but
yeah, good point.
Charles Grimaldi, he told his biographer, a guy named John Kidner, who was an Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He was affiliated with the FBN. I didn't know that, Ted. Did you know that?
About Kidner?
Yeah.
No, I didn't know that. I didn't know. I actually didn't know anything about him. I've never looked him up.
So that's from.
I know that that it was an as told to book. Grimaldi speaking to Kidner.
Yeah, that's what it's. That's a hard book to get a hold of. This guy, Charles Grimaldi's
very expensive.
memoir.
Yeah, very pricey.
Yeah. So he makes the claim that Jimmy Hoffa participated in a first round of CIA mafia plots. Hoffa's liaison with Santo Trafficante at the time was a very important figure we'll have to get into more later in Hoffa's life, a guy named Roland McMaster, who's like a 6'5" goon. He has a glass eye. He's a very scary guy. We'll get into him a little later. McMaster, he had set up a Teamsters local in Miami with one of the murderers of Leon Cook, Dave Yaris. Now, according to Chucky Grimaldi, Jimmy was the original liaison between the CIA and the Mafia in this. And this plot, before the Robert Mayhew, Johnny Roselli plots, consisted of Ruffalo Buffalino, Sal Granello, Jimmy Plumieri, Gabriel Mainorino. These are guys from the Lucchese family and the Pittsburgh family who all had interests in Cuba at the time. Now, I mentioned earlier, and this is why I mentioned Jimmy's sojourn back to Minneapolis to help put down Farrell Dobbs and Denny Lewis and the CIO, when I said I think this is where they might have sucked Hoffa into this milieu. That's the only reason I do stop and think maybe Grimaldi was onto something here. Maybe he wasn't just making it all up for a memoir.
Could be.
And what was Bob Mayhew's connection to this? Robert Mayhew.
Oh, Robert Mayhew was the intermediary between the CIA and Johnny Roselli.
Okay.
Basically, what we're saying here is there's hints that there was a first round of plotting between the CIA and the Mafia, that Jimmy Hoffa brokered the deal between the CIA and then Russell Buffalino and the Lucchese's and the Pittsburgh and Philly mobs before the official one that we all know about, which is the Sheffield Edwards and Robert Mayhew and Johnny Roselli, if that makes sense. So two different plots.
Involving some of the same elements.
Yes.
And there was a lot of crossover, too, like Frank Sturgis, Frank Fiorini, to organized crime, too. I had his nephew on the show.
Oh, yeah.
We talked about his visiting with his...
Yes, and his organized crime connection was to, we just mentioned, Santo Trafficante.
Interesting. Yeah, I think he mentioned that, yeah.
I should mention that this isn't just some of the details are only from Charles Grimaldi's his stories, but Time Magazine actually did break the possibility of this when it does mention this first round of plotting with Buffalino and Jimmy Hoffa and all of those guys.
Doesn't that article talk about money that they had buried in Cuba? Some of these people, like the Pluneri and Granello.
That's kind of what they could. Yeah, the impression that the Time Magazine article gives is that they wanted the gangsters were going to help them with the actual plotting of invading Cuba, and the dangle was that they could go back and get their stashed money back.
Yeah, there would have to have been stashed money there. Yeah. How would they get it out? In that rush. We only got about 2 minutes left. What do you guys want to wrap up here? Give a little brief wrap up, 1 minute each. And then we'll be back next week with another hour.
So I know I diverted into a lot of deep politics that involved, international narcotics trafficking by way of gangsters and thugs that the CIA was using to help put down revolutionary movements in Europe. But like I said, and I'm working at documenting this, and I'm very close, I'll just say that this was the first time that they probably sucked Hoffa into these types of networks, if that makes sense.
And Ted, what do you want to leave us with?
Well, I just want to say that the part 3 of this may be the most interesting part of all, because I think we're going to get into some stuff that the audience doesn't know about, such as what he mentioned about the alliance that LaRouche had with the Teamsters. And yeah, and this guy that's one of the linchpins between the Santo Trafficante elements and the people that ended up killing Hoffa and disposing of his body, possibly, is this guy Roland McMaster.
Mm-hmm. The very, very scary guy.
Yeah. And,
very interesting. So let's regroup, and we'll start again taping in a little while. And thank you so much. We had Ted Kopesky and Steve Kopesky and Ted Rubinstein. I'm getting so freaking old, man. I'm losing it, guys. And we'll be back with more of this. Yeah, I know, man. We'll be back with the great Ted Rubinstein and the great Steve Kopesky after this.
Thank you.